So, long-awaited, and that's understating it, Watchmen, adaptation of a classic comic novel co-written by Alan Moore, who famously has sort of taken his name off it and indeed off movie adaptations of his work because he doesn't like them. He was on the Culture Show about a year ago, and maybe a couple of years ago. He was talking about why he didn't like his work being adapted and the problems that he had with From Hell and League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and V for Vendetta, which he said was the kind of final straw. And he's now at the point when he just says he doesn't want to be credited. So when the credits come up at the beginning, it just says co-created by Dave Gibbons, and Alan Moore's name isn't on it. And I believe that his arrangement was he doesn't get anything from it. He doesn't want anything to do with it. He just wants clear blue water between him and it. There was an interview that was done at a Comic-Con a while ago in which somebody was saying, look, do you have any opinions about it? He said, yes, I've put a curse on it. And they said, but it's directed by Zac Snyder, who's apparently a very nice guy. And Alan Moore said, yes, but he also directed 300. So there is a long-standing thing with Alan Moore doesn't like and won't see, more to the point. It's not that he takes against you, he won't see them. So that's fine. And just because Alan Moore doesn't like them doesn't mean nobody else should, but we have to establish that at the very, very beginning. So the film is, the story of Watchmen. Did you read Watchmen when you were younger?
No, I didn't.
An interesting thing happened. It's
one of those things that you catch up with later.
Yeah, no.
Unless you're particularly finally tuned in to the comic world, which I wasn't in 86.
I wasn't, but I was given the compiled Watchmen by a guy called Simon Clarke, actually. And it was very interesting because
Simon Clarke?
Yeah. No, that's not the interesting bit. I was talking to somebody else who's a really big, thank you, who's a big comic book fan. I said, Watchmen. He said, I remember reading it when I was a teenager. He said, no, you don't. You remember reading it in your 20s. And it's interesting that I remember being younger than I was when I read it. Of course, I wasn't a teenager when I read it. I was indeed in my 20s. I just retrospectively remember being a much younger person. This relates to something that Melvin Bragg was saying, that the point that you are when you encounter works actually affects the way you think about it. And I thought at the time, gosh, this is terribly profound and terribly important and terribly political and terribly adventurous. It's set in an alternative world in which Nixon has been able to be re-elected. The Vietnam War has been won through use of Dr. Manhattan Blue Giant. You had a whole race of people who came together who were Caped Crusaders. Then Caped Crusading was outlawed. Now nuclear Armageddon is looming, and the old group, which is actually the second generation old group, are thinking of reforming, one of their number having been recently murdered. And believe me, what I'm doing, although it already sounds incomprehensible, is a massively simplified version of the plot itself, which is very, very multi-stranded, very, very multi-layered, very, very complicated. Here's a clip.
I heard he'd been working for the government. Maybe it was a political killing.
Maybe someone's picking off costumed heroes.
John thinks that there's going to be a nuclear war.
What if that's why someone wants us out of the way? So we can't do anything to stop it. An attack on one is an attack on all of us.
Watchmen are over. What do you suggest we do about it?
Retribution.
We can save this world. Why would I save a world I no longer have any stake in?
Do it for me.
The world will look up and shout, save us. And I'll whisper, no.
Everybody probably knows this already, but the film went through several directors who was meant to be up for doing it. Terry Gilliam at one point was meant to be doing it. He thought it would only work as a TV miniseries. He famously said to Alan Moore, how would you do it? Alan Moore famously said, I wouldn't. We were here in this studio talking to Paul Greengrass at one point. After Paul Greengrass, I think it must have been when he just won something for United 93 or maybe one of the Bourne movies. And we spoke to him and he was actually on the set where he was going to direct Watchmen. Do you remember this? Mm-hmm. They were in pre-production and the blimp was up and everything was ready to go. And then that fell down again. The project has now been brought to us by visionary, in inverted commas, director Zac Snyder, who did that retooling of Dawn of the Dead and then famously did 300, which was obviously, similarly graphic and similarly concerned with style over content. The thing about Zac Snyder is this: he absolutely loves the source material. Clearly, demonstrably, is in love with the source material. All the stuff you read about, everyone was walking around on set with copies of the original material. This is the visual reference. This is how he wanted it to work. And of course, the strip's co-creator is credited and is absolutely on board with the project. So there is no question that he's a fan. The problem is he is also a fanboy, and there are things that go with being a fanboy that are deeply problematic.
What's a fanboy?
Fanboy is a phrase which is used in relation to horror fans, which is geeky, nerdy horror fans who are absolutely devoted to the movies themselves, but possibly without relation to the real world. They are classically, and I would say...
Weirdos.
Well, no, they're classically people who I would count as my own parish, spotty, geeky, awkward adolescents with no friends who love spending the time in the Scala cinema watching, obscure Fulci movies. Actually, I don't really like Lucio Fulci very much, but they would be the horror fanboys. Obsessives, right? People who are obsessive about detail. The thing with Zac Snyder is this: there is no doubting that what he's done in this adaptation of Watchmen, which is 18 certificate, has got violence and apparently adult subject matter, has decided to go in and do what he thinks is the Citizen Kane of graphic novel film adaptations, in the same way that the original was referred to as the Citizen Kane of comic strips. It was awarded very, very respectable literary prizes and broke out in a way that other strips hadn't done up until that point. But he is a man who understands surfaces more than he understands anything else. Now, I need to be very, very clear about this. It may be partly a function of how old I was when I read Watchmen and how profound I thought it was. But the thing that I got most from watching Watchmen was that it was all surface and no depth. And I don't remember that being the case with the original. I've subsequently spoken to some other people who said, oh yeah, but what you're talking about is a fault with the original. I don't think it is, but I can't face going back to revisit the original. I know how I felt about it when it was first written. I felt that it was politically interesting and politically radical. I think that for all its political gesturing, the film isn't. I mean, the film, it makes a great deal of political gestures. There's a restaging of the Kennedy assassination. There is a guy playing Nixon in the war room, which is meant to look like Dr. Strangelove. But what you do is you sit there going, well, that's a guy who's meant to be Nixon, which of course for me is incredibly important. But actually all I'm interested in is the fact that he's got a very big comical stick-on rubber nose. And he's in the Dr. Strangelove war room, but he doesn't seem to be doing anything that would in any way imply the depth or the satire or the sort of spark of Dr. Strangelove. There are endless musical sections which seem to be positive. We get a little bit of Hendrix, we get a little bit of Simon and Garfunkel. We get a kind of montage sequence which throws together elements of pop culture, and it looks very impressive. But when you start picking it apart, you go, yes, but what does it all actually add up to? And the answer is not very much. And as Zac Snyder demonstrated when he did 300, in the end, he's kind of more interested in what people are wearing than what they're doing. Now, there is a thing in the original Watchmen which is about how putting on costumes changes characters and whether that in itself is a twisted and perverse thing. But it's not even as if Zac Snyder understands this. So you get one of the characters who's dressed very much in latex, and the latex just looks a little bit naff and a little bit 80s and a little bit, and I hate to say this, a little bit Duran Duran. Okay, so generally, I have a problem with getting below the surface. Second thing is that this problem about him being flippant on the one hand and portentous on the other means that because he has no depth, when the stuff gets into murky territory, like when it has a near rape sequence, when it has a hideous sequence involving child abduction, he does not know how to deal with that. It's like he can't do serious. All he can do is flippant. So the portentous stuff just sounds flippant at best, and at worst sounds terribly adolescent and terribly misguided. The third thing is length is not a measure of depth. Just because something is 2 3/4 hours long doesn't mean it has 2 3/4 hours worth of stuff to say. Now, Paul Greengrass, who of course is a very intelligent, political director, wanted to change the story, wanted to update it. Snyder said, no, I don't want to do any of that. I want to absolutely stick with the original. But just liking the comic isn't enough to mediate that, to put it on screen. And the worst thing is, and I mean, I hate to say this because I understand that at the heart of it is somebody who really wants to put The Watchmen up there on screen. It's not as good a movie as V for Vendetta. Now, Alan Moore hated the idea of V for Vendetta. But V for Vendetta, since we've got to accept that Watchmen the film is not the comic, you have to ask yourself, does it work on the level of a film? The answer is no. It's long and baggy and quite boring, and the visuals occasionally are arresting, but equally occasionally look slightly Spandau Ballet and a little bit sub-Blade Runner and a little bit post-300 and a little bit not quite Sin City. And the graphic violence, which Snyder has held out for, seems to be there for no reason other than to say, hey, you know, I'm holding out for the graphic violence. Well, I've got nothing against graphic splatter, but 2 hours, 45 minutes for a few moments of graphic splatter is a really long haul. Plus, on top of all this, there's the sense all the way through it that the movie thinks that it's telling you something really fundamentally profound, whilst all the time skimming over the surface, like in that Harry skipping over the waters like a stone. And if you look at a movie like V for Vendetta, the film holds together on its own. Whether or not Alan Moore likes it doesn't matter. V for Vendetta works as a movie, okay? It actually works narratively. The pain that the characters feel works. There are some scenes in it which are terribly brutal, but they work, and it has an incredibly radical ending that's kind of pantomimey but hangs together. Watchmen comes at you with what it looks like. Somebody described it as the Brody's Notes of 20th century. Nigel Floyd, in fact. My great colleague Nigel Floyd described it as the Brody's Notes of 20th century culture. And he's quite right. That's what it feels like. Just because you've got a lot of pop culture references doesn't mean you're actually doing anything interesting with them. So it's a really strange thing. And I came out of it in a state of, well, partly exhaustion, because it's much too long. It's much, much too long. And Terry Gilliam was probably right that it should have been done as a miniseries. But more frustratingly, with the sense that just because you give the material to somebody who really likes the material doesn't mean that that person necessarily knows the best thing to do with the material on screen. And a classic example of that, Stanley Kubrick in The Shining. Everyone other than me thinks The Shining is one of the greatest horror movies ever made. Stanley Kubrick had almost no respect for the original at all, but he did something interesting with it that worked for a number of people. Snyder is, in the end, not Christopher Nolan. He's not the guy who's got the sort of nous to. I mean, I don't think Dark Knight is the masterpiece that everybody thinks it is, but I think in terms of what happened with Batman Begins, making a massive art house movie that just happens to look like a huge blockbuster. In the end, he's Zack Snyder. He's Zack Snyder. Hey, he's Richie Potts.
Don't start doing the voices.
No, I'm
again.
sorry, but
it'll upset the cats.
So there's the frustration. If I'm going to spend 2 hours and 45 minutes, I'd like to spend it in the company of Paul Greengrass or Terry Gilliam or somebody who's going to say something more other than, hey, Watchmen, it's really cool.